Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling what I think is one of the most amazing paradoxes in all of biology.
Oh, yeah. Which one is that?
How does an animal eat and break down food, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, without also dissolving itself?
Right.
I mean, its own body is made of the very same stuff.
It's the ultimate internal demolition job, isn't it?
Yeah.
You need this system that's powerful enough to deconstruct another organism, but contained enough so it doesn't deconstruct you.
Exactly. And the way animals solve this is all about sequential, highly protected stages.
It's an elegant blueprint, really.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to follow that blueprint from the ingredients an animal needs through the specialized machinery that processes it, and then all the way to the hormones that keep the whole system running on schedule.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The inventory. Every adequate diet has to be built on, well, three fundamental pillars.
Yep.
First is chemical energy, the fuel for ATP that powers everything.
Right? Vision, flight, just thinking.
Second, you need organic building blocks. So sources of carbon and nitrogen to build your own molecules.
Those two seem pretty straightforward. But the third one, essential nutrients, that's where it gets really interesting.
It is. These are the things your body absolutely has to have, but just can't make itself from simple organic molecules.
And our sources break this down into four key types, right? Starting with amino acids.
Yep. Every organism uses 20 amino acids to build its proteins. The thing is, animals can only synthesize about half of those.
So the rest have to come from food.
The remaining 8 or 9 for human infants are called the essential amino acids. They have to come ready-made in your diet.
Which brings up that whole idea of complete versus incomplete proteins.
Exactly. Animal products, meat, eggs, that sort of thing are complete. They've got all the essentials.
But most plant proteins are incomplete. They're usually missing one or two.
Right, like corn lacks tryptophan and lysine, but then beans, they lack methionine.
So the solution is just to combine them.
The beauty is in the combination, yeah. Rice and beans is the classic example. Together, they give you the complete set.
And this same idea applies to essential fatty acids, too.
It does. We need them for things like cell membranes, for signaling molecules, but we just don't have the enzymes to create certain double bonds, like the ones in linoleic acid.
Okay, next up are vitamins. These are the organic molecules you only need in, well, tiny, tiny amounts.
Vanishingly small. We're talking milligrams or even tenths of a milligram per day, and they mostly work as coenzymes, helping enzymes do their jobs.
And there's a really critical distinction here, isn't there, between water-soluble and fat-soluble.
Oh, absolutely crucial for your health. The water-soluble ones, like vitamin B2 or vitamin C, are generally safe. If you take too much, your body just excretes the excess.
But the fat-soluble ones are a different story.
A totally different story. Vitamins A, D, E, and K. Because they're stored in your body fat, they can actually accumulate to toxic levels if you take high doses.
So you have to be much more careful with those.
Much more. And the last category is minerals. These are the inorganic nutrients, things like iron, sodium, calcium.
And their jobs are just all over the place. Iron is at the core of hemoglobin, right?
Yep. And then you have sodium, potassium chloride, which are just fundamental for how your nerves fire and your muscles contract.
Speaking of sodium, I saw a pretty startling fact in our sources on this.
What's up?
The typical American diet provides something like 20 times the required amount of sodium.
20 times. That's a huge overconsumption for something you only need for basic cell function. And it has obvious links to hypertension.
So when a diet is missing any of these pillars,
Mhm.
the energy, the building blocks, the nutrients, that's what we call malnutrition.
Correct. And if you're lacking the chemical energy specifically, that's undernourishment, your body is forced to start consuming itself.
It burns through your stored carbs and fat first.
And then eventually it starts breaking down its own proteins. Your muscles shrink. It's a very serious situation.
The history here is just full of incredible discoveries, like folic acid, vitamin B9.
Right. The work of Richard Smithles. He had this hypothesis that neural tube defects in newborns might be caused by malnutrition.
Yeah, he was right.
He was. He proved that vitamin supplementation just dramatically cut the risk. Folic acid was the key. And that one insight was so powerful that in 1998, the U.S. mandated it be added to grain products.
An amazing public health story.
Really?
Okay, so that brings us to the next big question. We know what we need. Now, how do we actually get it and process it?
It happens in 4 main stages. First, ingestion, eating.
Then digestion, the breakdown part.
Then absorption, taking up the small molecules. And finally, elimination of the waste.
When you look at ingestion, the sheer variety of animal strategies is, well, it's wild.
The sources bring it down into four main types, and each one is a beautiful example of evolutionary adaptation.
You've got your filter feeders, a humpback whale using its baleen to strain krill from the water.
Then substrate feeders. Think of a caterpillar eating its way through the leaf it lives on.
There are fluid feeders, like a mosquito or a tsetse fly.
And finally, bulk feeders. That's us, and most mammals. We eat big chunks of food. The rock python is maybe the ultimate example.
Oh, with the unhinging jaw.
Exactly. It's not unhinged, but it's held by this really elastic ligament, which lets it swallow prey way bigger than its own head.
Just incredible.
Yeah.
So once that food is in, we're back to that initial paradox.
Yeah.
How do you avoid self-digestion?
Compartmentalization. It's all about keeping the dangerous chemistry contained.
The simplest method is intracellular, right? Inside the cells.
Right. Sponges do this. Food vacuoles merge with lysosomes, and digestion happens right inside the cell. But most animals use extracellular digestion.
So breakdown happens outside the cells in a special cavity.
And there are two main designs. The simpler one is a gastrovascular cavity. It's like a pouch with one opening for both mouth and anus. A hydra has this.
But for a complex animal, you need something more efficient.
You need the alimentary canal, a complete digestive tract, a tube with two openings, a mouth, and an anus.
Which allows for sequential processing.
The critical evolutionary upgrade. You can keep eating while the last meal is still being digested further down the line.
And that sequential setup really defines the mammalian system. The process kicks off, the second food enters the oral cavity.
Your teeth start the mechanical work, just increasing the surface area. And saliva kicks in with mucus for lubrication, buffles for acid, and an enzyme, salivary amylase.
Which starts breaking down starch immediately.
Instantly. The tongue rolls this all into a ball, a bolus, and pushes it back to the pharynx.
And this is where that amazing safety feature kicks in, the swallowing reflex.
It's something you never think about, but it's so important. Your larynx moves up, and this little flap, the epiglottis, tips down to cover your trachea.
It's that split-second move that makes sure food goes down the esophagus and not your windpipe.
And it moves down via peristalsis, those waves of muscle contraction.
Then it hits a sphincter and enters the stomach, which is doing two jobs at once.
Right. One is storage. It can hold up to 2 liters of food and drink. And 2 is processing that food into an acidic liquid called chyme.
And the chemistry here is, as we said, brutal. The stomach secretes gastric juice with a pH of about 2.
That acidity is from hydrochloric acid, HCl, and it's strong enough to denature proteins on contact.
But the main digestive enzyme is pepsin.
Right, a protease. But here's the safety feature. It's secreted in an inactive form, pepsinogen.
So it doesn't digest the cells that make it.
Exactly. Only when it hits the HCl in the stomach does it become active pepsin. And even cooler, pepsin itself can activate more pepsinogen.
Another positive feedback loop.
A powerful one.
So with all that acid and protein-digesting enzyme, how does the stomach not just dissolve?
2 layers of defense. First, a thick coating of mucus. And second, incredibly rapid cell replacement. The entire epithelial lining regenerates every 3 days.
Wow. Every 3 days.
So that acidic chyme is then let out, just a little squirt at a time, through another sphincter into the small intestine.
And the small intestine is really the star of the show. It's 6 meters long.
And that first 25-centimeter section, the duodenum, is where the chyme gets mixed with secretions from accessory glands. It's where the real action is.
The pancreas jumps in first. It gets a signal from a hormone, secretin.
And it releases bicarbonate, which neutralizes all that stomach acid, super important. It also releases enzymes like trypsin and chymotrypsin.
At the same time, the liver is making bile, which is stored in the gallbladder.
Right, and another hormone, CCK, tells the gallbladder to release that bile. And bile salts act like emulsifiers. They break up big fat globules into tiny droplets,
Increasing the surface area for the enzymes.
massively increasing it. Now, about that surface area for absorption. The small intestine is an engineering marvel.
It has folds, and then on the folds are these finger-like things called villi.
And on each cell of those villi are thousands of even tinier projections, the microvilli. It's called the brush border.
And if you were to flatten it all out,
You'd have an area of 200 to 300 square meters, the size of a tennis court.
that's just an astonishing commitment to maximizing absorption.
It really is. And once those nutrients are absorbed, they follow 2 completely different paths.
Okay, what are they?
The water-soluble stuff, amino acids, sugars, they go right into the blood capillaries. All those capillaries merge into the hepatic portal vein, which leads straight to the liver,
The liver acts as a gatekeeper.
a critical gatekeeper. It regulates nutrient levels, like your blood sugar, and it detoxifies anything harmful, like alcohol or drugs, before that blood goes to the rest of the body.
But fats take a different route.
A total detour. They get reassembled into triglycerides, coated with protein to make them water-soluble, and formed into these globules called chylomicrons.
And they're too big for the capillary.
Too big, so they enter the lymphatic system through vessels called lacteals. This means the fats bypass the liver completely on the first pass and enter the blood up near the heart.
Fascinating. So finally, we get to the large intestine.
The colon, cecum, and rectum. And its main job is a really simple but vital: water recovery.
How much water are we talking about?
Well, about 9 liters of fluid enters your digestive tract every day from what you drink and what's secreted. The large intestine recovers all but about 100 milliliters of that,
And the leftover undigested stuff, like fiber, becomes feces.
stored in the rectum. And it's interesting to note, the bacteria in your colon make up about 1/3 of the dry weight of that feces.
Which is a perfect lead-in to all the evolutionary adaptations. I mean, things like teeth and gut length are just perfectly tuned to what an animal eats.
Oh, absolutely. Dentition tells you the diet right away. Carnivores have sharp, tearing teeth. Herbivores have broad, grinding molars.
And omnivores like us have a bit of everything.
A generalist's toolkit. And you see the same adaptation in the length of the gut. Herbivores have much, much longer alimentary canals than carnivores.
Because it just takes longer to break down tough plant matter.
Far longer. You need more time and more surface area. Compare a lion's short tract to a koala's, which needs all that length to process eucalyptus.
But the most important partnership is the one with our microbiome.
The 10 to 100 trillion bacteria living in our gut. They are not just passengers, they are essential partners. They make vitamins for us, DSK, biotin, folic acid, and they help regulate our immune system.
The research here is just exploding.
Yeah.
Like with H. pylori, the bacterium that causes ulcers.
Right. An infection with H. pylori can basically wipe out most of the other bacterial species in the stomach. It shows how delicate that ecosystem is.
And we're now using this knowledge for therapies.
Life-saving ones. Fecal microbial transplantation is incredibly effective for nasty antibiotic-resistant infections like C. difficile.
So since animals can't digest cellulose on their own, herbivores have to rely on these microbes.
Entirely. They have specialized fermentation chambers to house them. In horses, it's a huge cecum. In the Hotson bird, it's a muscular crop.
But the most complex system is in the ruminants. Cows, sheep, deer.
They have that 4-chambered stomach. They eat grass, let the microbes in the rumen work on it, then they regurgitate it as cud and chew it again.
To really maximize the microbial breakdown.
And then they get nutrients not just from the grass, but by digesting the microbes themselves further down the line. It's incredibly efficient.
And for a truly extreme adaptation, you just have to look at those giant tube worms at hydrothermal vents.
No digestive system at all. They rely completely on chemototrophic bacteria living inside them to make their food.
It's an unbelievable machine.
Yeah.
And it all needs careful management, which brings us to regulation.
The whole show is run by the local enteric nervous system and a cocktail of hormones.
It's all about feedback loops.
Specific ones. When food stretches the stomach releases gastrin. Gastrin then tells the stomach to make more gastric juice.
A positive feedback loop to get digestion going.
Exactly. Then, when that acidic chyme enters the duodenum, the small intestine releases secretin and CCK,
And secretin tells the pancreas to release bicarbonate to neutralize the acid.
while CCK tells the pancreas to release enzymes and the gallbladder to release bile. But here's the negative feedback. If the meal is really fatty, the high levels of secretin and CCK also inhibit the stomach, slowing everything down to give the system time to deal with all that fat.
So elegant. And hormones also manage our overall energy budget.
Right, our glucose homeostasis. Excess energy gets stored first as glycogen in the liver and muscles,
And after that, as fat.
which is the most space-efficient storage we have. And this is all managed by 2 antagonistic hormones from the pancreas.
Insulin and glucagon.
When blood sugar is high after a meal, beta cells release insulin, which tells cells to take up glucose and store it.
And when blood sugar is low, alpha cells release glucagon, which tells the liver to break down glycogen and release glucose.
The one big exception being your brain cells. They can take up glucose anytime, with or without insulin, a critical failsafe.
And when this system breaks, that's diabetes.
Type 1 is an autoimmune disease that destroys the insulin-making cells. Type 2, which is far more common, is when cells start responding to insulin properly, insulin resistance.
Finally, our appetite itself is also controlled by this hormonal tug-of-war.
It is. The main I'm hungry signal is ghrelin from the stomach. And fighting against it are the appetite suppressants.
like leptin from fat cells and insulin and PYY from the small intestine.
All of them signaling to the brain's satiety center that, we're good on energy for now.
This has been such a clear journey. The digestive system is just a masterpiece of protected sequential chemistry.
It's a self-regulating chemical factory, fine-tuned by hormones and completely dependent on microbial partners.
And as a final thought for you to take away, think about that hormonal control over appetite. It's really profound.
It is. Studies on people who are dieting show that when they successfully lose weight, their levels of ghrelin, that hunger hormone, often go up significantly.
And the suppressants go down.
Exactly. The body is literally fighting to get those fat reserves back. It shows that managing weight is a complex biological challenge, so much more than just willpower.
And understanding that metabolic resistance, that's the powerful knowledge you gain from this deep dive. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth look at animal nutrition.